Welcome. I don't know if you can hear me, if this is working or not, but I come from a big family, so I have a big mouth, and I can yell pretty loud anyhow. But I hope you can hear me, and if you can't, raise your hand. Good? All right. Thank you so much for coming here today. My name is Mike Merwicki. I'm a state representative. I'm a Southerner. I come from southern Vermont like Rich, and we get called Southerners up here, even though we don't have grits and gravy for breakfast every morning. But we are still Vermonters. And I want to welcome everybody. I want to thank Brianna from the Vermont Commission on Native American Affairs for helping pull this together. And I just want to share a few announcements as we get started. The first one is we've come to understand that the building closes at 6 o'clock, and we were scheduled to go until 6, but we need to stop it at 10 of 6. So that may crunch things a little bit, but the building closes then. We're going to need some time to clear people out. And as they sometimes say in the bar, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. So I just wanted to welcome everyone. I'm glad you could be here at the State House. This is the people's house, and we want to make sure everyone gets to enjoy this and have a program that's beneficial. What I've been sharing with people about this program here is that there's been a lot said and written about Vermont Abenaki lately, but little to none of it from the Vermont Abenaki. And it's been disappointing to see the bias that I've witnessed in the news. It doesn't give you the opportunity to tell your own story. So that's why we're here tonight. We want to make sure that you have your chance. We want to make sure that this is a friendly and an orderly event. And we understand that there's some strong opinions people hold about your lives, about your land. And we want to respect that. We also want to make sure the decorum of the State House is maintained at all times. So we have a facilitator for tonight's program, and I'm glad that we get a chance to have her back in the State House because she served here in the Vermont House until the last year. And so at this point, I'm going to introduce. Oh, I'm sorry, it's Brianna. Are you next?
It's going to be Dan, actually.
Okay. Sorry, I'm catching up on things. But thank you again for coming here.
Thanks, Mike. Good evening. Welcome, both legislators and members of the public. For this evening's event, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dan Kutzer. I'm chair of the Commission, Vermont's Commission on Native American Affairs. In recent months, the Commission has received requests from multiple legislators for an opportunity to learn more about the state's tribal recognition process and to engage with the Vermont Abenaki community. Given the Commission's statutory charge, we thought that we would be in the best position to coordinate this opportunity. Toward this end, the Commission's Administrative Director, Brianna Sheehan, who will be speaking next, will provide an overview of the state's recognition process. And then we've invited Vermont Abenaki leaders, scholars, and allies to share their thoughts and to answer questions. We hope the event will serve as an educational opportunity for everyone to clarify and learn more about the tribal recognition process and to engage directly with those who have lived experience in and with Vermont's Abenaki communities. With this in mind, and the short amount of time we have, which just got shorter, we're going to ask that questions related to the content be saved to the end. So if you have a question pop up, make a note of it in your mind or on paper, whatever works for you, and then we'll deal with them all batched at the end. You may find that as we're going along, that the answer to your question gets presented later in the process. Often happens. So with all that, thank you very much for being here, and I'd like to introduce Brianna Sheehan.
everybody. My name is Brianna Sheehan. I am the Administrative Director for the Vermont Commission on Native American Affairs. I am here in this position a little less than a year, and I am also the first paid staff person that the Commission has had in the 20 some odd years that they have been operating. So really honored to be here, really honored to be able to work for the Commission and on behalf of Vermont's Indigenous population. And really hoping that this position allows us to have more educational opportunities like this in the future. So thank you. Grab my water also. So Marge, if you could hit the next slide. So I'm going to talk to you today about a little bit of a brief overview of the commission itself, and then I'm going to talk through just the state recognition process. So first, what is the VCNA? So while different councils and commissions have advised on Native American affairs at a state level since as early as 1991, the commission, as you know it today, has only been in existence since 2006, and it was established then by the legislature. Vermont Commission is appointed by the governor, and it serves as a state-level advisory body on issues impacting Native American communities in Vermont. In short, the commission is tasked with, 1, recognizing the historic and cultural contributions of Native Americans to Vermont, 2, to protect and strengthen their heritage, and 3, to address their needs in state policies, programs, and actions. So, who is on the commission? Without vacancies, the VCNAA is composed of 9 members, all of which are appointed by the governor. By statute, the only real requirement of serving on the commission is being a resident of Vermont for a minimum of 3 years. Other than that, the commission should reflect diverse affiliations and geographic locations from Vermont, but Native heritage or tribal affiliation is not a necessary prerequisite. One caveat, though, is that when a Native American tribe is recognized by the state, a recommended candidate from that community does have priority to sit on the commission. So now you know who's on the commission. What do they do? The commission has several very important statutory obligations. The first is to assist state-recognized tribes to, number 1, secure assistance for things like social services, education, healthcare, housing, as well as to develop and market Native American fine and performing arts, craft work, and cultural events. The second duty is related to that, to develop policies and programs that benefit Vermont's Native population. And then finally, which I'll get into more, is to oversee and coordinate Vermont's state recognition process. So before we get into Vermont's process specifically, for those who don't know, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what state recognition is generally. So in the United States, state recognition, though it varies a lot by state, usually refers to, 1, the formal acknowledgement of the long-standing existence of a Native tribe within a state's border, and/or the formalization of a relationship between a state government and a Native tribal government. As of 2013, 21 states, including Vermont, have recognized 73 tribes that are not also federally recognized. And it maybe goes without saying, but state recognition is separate from federal recognition. They are different processes and they have different implications. So getting into the state tribal recognition process specifically, the process and criteria for Vermont's process was put forth in 2010 in Senate Bill 222, also known as Act 107, an act relating to state recognition of Native American Indian tribes in Vermont. Very, very briefly, and I'll get into it, the process is as follows. A Native American group seeking recognition submits an application to the VCNAA. The commission and an expert review panel review the application and supporting documentation and decide whether to recommend that application to the legislature. If it moves on to the legislature, a bill is introduced and it proceeds through standard legislative processes. And if it passes, then it can be signed into law by the governor. So when a Native group is seeking state recognition, their first step is to file an application with the VCNAA. To be eligible for recognition, the applicant group must demonstrate compliance with a series of criteria that are set forth in Act 107. To demonstrate that compliance, they are required to provide lots of documentation, not limited to historical records, genealogical records and information, oral histories, scholarly research, and governing documents. So the criteria themselves, you can see on the board, there's 8 of them. They're pretty comprehensive. I'll just highlight a couple of them for you. So the majority of residents reside in Vermont of the petitioning group. They have to demonstrate a connection with Native American Indian tribes that have historically inhabited Vermont. They have to have an enduring community presence. They are organized in part to preserve and promote Native history and culture and address the needs of their citizens. So once an application is received by the commission is obligated to do a couple of things. The first is to provide public notice of that application, and the second is to hold at least one public hearing about that application. Additionally, they are statutorily obligated to work with the applicant to appoint a 3-member review panel consisting of scholars that are identified based on their expertise in everything from cultural and physical anthropology to Indian law to archaeology to genealogy and other related subjects. All members of the panel are volunteers, and no member of the review panel may be a member of the commission or affiliated with the petitioning group. Once the panel has issued their report, the commission will review the application, the panel report, and any additional documentation, and they will vote to pass the application on to the legislature. This decision requires a majority vote by members of the commission, and if a member of the commission is on the tribal roll of the applicant, they are ineligible to participate. So once an application is recommended to the legislature, as I said, a bill is introduced to formally recognize the tribe. The bill proceeds through standard legislative processes, including committee review, public testimony, and floor votes in both chambers, and if it passed, it can be signed into law by the governor. To date, 5 applications for recognition have been submitted to the commission, and 4 of those have been signed into law, including chiefs of communities you'll hear represented here, the Elnu Abenaki tribe and the Mohegan Band of the Pusak Abenaki Nation in 2011, and the Abenaki Nation of Missisquoi and the Coasuk Traditional Band of the Coas Abenaki Nation in 2012. And so to start to wrap this all together, what does recognition really mean in Vermont? First and foremost, state recognition is both very personal and political. More than anything, state recognition provides an official and legal acknowledgement of a tribe's historical and cultural presence in the state, in our case, Vermont. Additionally, it allows Native American artisans to list their work as Native American made, and it grants tribes the ability to pursue funding and resources that may allow them to better support their communities. One thing that state recognition is not, though, is federal recognition. So unlike federal recognition, state recognition does not entitle tribes to the same authority or jurisdiction as state or local governments. It does not entitle them to funding or services from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and it does not entitle them to land claims or gambling activities. And so to sum it all up, the Vermont Commission on Native American Affairs really plays a vital role in a couple of things. One, advising the state on Native American affairs, advocating for Vermont's indigenous population and state-recognized tribes, and overseeing and executing the state's tribal recognition process as developed and designed by the legislature. And state recognition, especially for communities, is not just symbolic. It affirms and uplifts histories, identity, and continued presence of Vermont's indigenous peoples, and it creates opportunities for both tribes and the state to better serve and meet the needs of Vermont's indigenous population. That's all I have for you. But if you have any questions about what I've shared tonight, there's a ton of information on the Commission's website. You are welcome to email me My email is in the program tonight. Or there are also some resources in the program as well that will provide some additional information. So thank you so much. And with that, I will pass it to Dr. Mark Bruchak.
And we're just waiting for the technology.
Oh, we're waiting for the technology.
Bree, can you maybe do a brief introduction of this one? But not for some reason.
We're waiting on technology, apologies, but
Peter, why don't you go next while I get the technology sorted, just so we don't lose time.
do you want, yeah, let's do.
Yeah, because I'm not sure what the problem is.
We have to tap something not related to
Yeah.
computers.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, it's- Before, it just went right up.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Catherine Sims, and I'm honored to serve as today's panel moderator. I'm a former state representative and someone deeply committed to creating,
See, that's all it took.
all it took is getting started. So we're going to go back to Margaret Brueck to give her presentation before we do the panel.
All right, well, in the short time we have, I'm offering you a very brief overview of historical encounters in tribal communities in the traditional homelands of the Native people known today as Abenaki. The talk is in 4 parts, emphasizing several key points in each section that you'll see on each of the title pages. If we're moving forward, hold on. Technology has its own mind. All right, we'll do it this way. So the first section is on locating Abenaki communities. Technically, the term Abenaki or Abenaki is not limited to a single location or a single tribe. It derives from the term Wabanakiak, combining the morphemes for dawn, Woban, and land, Aki, to designate people from where the daylight comes. The territory stretches from Soquawkeek, Northfield, Massachusetts in the south, to Kitsitecwa, the St. Lawrence River in the north, and from Soboqua, the Atlantic Ocean in the east, to Betobaqua, Lake Champlain in the west. For many generations, long before and after colonists arrived, Abenaki families resided in these and other locations. Although modern nation states are inclined to identify communities as fixed in location, there were actually very few hard and fast boundaries. Archaeological, historical, and ethnographic records document fluid movements over time as Native family bands came together, dispersed, or relocated as needed in response to seasonal needs and external pressures. Coastal Eastern Abenaki include the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Macbeth, and Maliseet of present-day Maine and Maritimes. The inland Western Abenaki includes Sokoke and Powesek, the Quakan and Pennacook, and Missisquoi and Winooski, among many others. Tribal identities were linked to particular places, often described in locative terms that describe some aspect of the land itself. For example, Missisquoi comes from Mazikskoi, meaning at the flint, referring to the chert outcrops found near present-day Swanton, Vermont. The region we now call Vermont was by no means an uninhabited wilderness. It has been continuously occupied by indigenous people for roughly 12,000 years since the glaciers receded. From the Paleolithic, Archaic, and woodland eras to the present, Abenaki people have continued long-standing strategies of seasonal hunting and fishing and flexible home sites, traveling in small family bands, while adapting to dramatic and subtle shifts in the climate. Natural resources are abundant. Oral traditions and archaeological records alike testify to fishing technologies in the form of spears, nets, and even stone weirs called aqueductin to channel fish into traps. The landscape was managed in part by periodic burns of pitch pine oak forests on sandy outwash river deltas. In 1772, for example, Peter Kalm remarked that the Missisquoi Indians frequently make great fires, which spread over the woods when everything is dry. These were not accidental, since burning to facilitate travel, control pests, flush game, and clear settlements was common for thousands of years. Abenaki people also encouraged and maintained forests of desirable species, notably maple and birch, tapped for sap, and nut trees, by sowing, transplanting, and thinning. As just one example of the deep roots of forest management, historian John Moody notes the preservation of this knowledge and the Abenaki name for the Contoocook River, Bucklandekwa, Butternut River. Now, during the late 1600s, some Abenaki families chose to relocate northward into new locations in Algonquin territory. These villages near the St. Lawrence were under the protection of the French colonial government and the Catholic Church. The founding population of Beconcourt-Wollenot came from the Saco River and Norridgewock in western Maine around 1679. Wollenot elder Francois Neptune later recalled that the St. Lawrence River was the new dividing line between traditional Algonquin hunting territories in the north and Abenaki territories in the south. The village of Saint Francois or Odenak was first established in 1683 at Sillery, near the Chaudière River, but overpopulation, soil depletion, and disease forced its relocation. Over time, families from more than 20 distinct Abenaki communities passed through Odenak. The population there was neither large nor static. Individuals and families came and went at will, returning when religious and social conflicts became too difficult to bear. Abenaki communities also took in refugees from elsewhere, especially in the aftermath of King Philip's War, 1675 to 76. Some families accepted the invitation of New York Governor Edmund Andros to go westward to live in a new refugee village established at Schaghticoke, Mohican territory. And during the 1690s, some of those refugees went further north to the missions on the St. Lawrence. Now here, it's crucial to note that only some, not all, Abenaki families moved to New France. Logistically, those mission villages were far too small to absorb entire tribal communities. A 1798 Crown survey of Saint Francois, for example, fixed the boundaries at only 2 miles square. Now, at first, the name St. Francis Abenaki applied specifically to the St. Francois de Sales mission in New France. But English colonial observers were so clueless about the extent of the territory that they began to vaguely refer to other Abenaki communities as though they were also St. Francis. Adding to the confusion, some of those communities embraced the St. Francis designation. Given the complexities of these tribal naming traditions over time, it is no wonder that confusion persists into the present day. This 1762 survey of Lake Champlain reflects a few important details about the relations between Missisquoi and Odenak in particular. On this map, at a site just above the Chazy River, there's a reference to the aftermath of Robert Rogers' October 1759 attack on Odenak, noting, on this part of the shore, Major Rogers had an engagement in 1760 with a large body of French and Indians. Now here, it's important to state that Abenaki communities routinely lent support to one another. In 1757, a group of Missisquoi warriors went to St. Francis to scout for the French army. Canadian Abenaki refugees in their turn took shelter at Missisquoi after Rogers' men had burned their village to the ground. This map also notes that the swamp was not surveyed, it being done without a great deal of time, or not being done without a great deal of time. And that swamp is the 900-acre McQuam Bog and Creek that are now part of the Missisquoi National Wildlife Refuge, managed in cooperation with the present-day Missisquoi Nation. A close-up view of this map gives us a few more details about colonial conflicts because it notes the location of the Missisquoi Indian castle used by the Warnoco Missisquoi war chief Greylock. Greylock was also known by the Abenaki name Lawanolowat, meaning he who fools the others or puts them off their track. Historian Gordon Day noted that this is so descriptive of his exploits during Dummer's War in the 1720s that it seems likely to have been bestowed at the time. Now, during the 1700s, adding to the confusion, Abenaki groups also participated to varying degrees in the Wabanaki Confederacy that linked together Eastern and Western nations. During this time, the Abenaki of Missisquoi were consistently identified by French officials as politically and geographically separate from the St. Francis Odenak Abenaki. Illustrating this independence, Greylock never settled for peace. Instead, he gathered warriors and continued to carry on his own war, raiding the frontier settlements long after the Eastern Abenaki had agreed in Dummer's Treaty to peace with the English. Another regional alliance, the Seven Nations Confederacy, connected Abenaki, Mohawk, and Wendat people living in the captive villages. Some were active members of both alliances, some were members of none, and some joined or rejoined at will to suit their own needs. Each nation spoke for itself. As a case in point, in 1721, when 18 tribal communities wrote to Massachusetts Governor Samuel Shute, forcefully stating they had not consented to selling their tribal land, despite what any individual person or nation might do, pictographic signatures represented each of the member nations. Missisquoi was included, as were Odanak and Walnock, but Penobscot and Coas were notably absent. Part 2. Now, one of the earliest maps of Abenaki territory, drawn by Jesuit Father Joseph Aubry in 1715, identifies several French Catholic missions, including Namansuk, the Norjwak mission, and Coas, the Coas mission. Now, although Abenaki people in northern New England were invited to move to New France, many, perhaps most, refused. In June 1704, for example, the Coas community, referring politely to the French governor as father, stated, "To tell you the truth, you have shown great care in inviting me to come and settle on your lands. However, I cannot bring myself to settle there because the English have already struck me too hard." And this is in the midst of the early French Indian Wars. Now, many early maps contain a great deal of bias and confusion and speculation, and it's awkward to refer to this region as Vermont, since the present-day states and boundaries did not exist until well after the French Indian Wars and after the American Revolution. European maps were also influenced by military conflicts. A note on this 1761 map admits as much, stating that the Connecticut River was not surveyed any further north than the Great Intervales, and that the trails drawn on the map indicate where captives were carried by the Indians, including from Coas to Missisquoi Bay. Some of the clearest details on this map are situated on the Atlantic coast, which had been heavily settled by English colonists by this time. Although locations in present-day Vermont and New Hampshire are sketchy, the White Mountains are clearly noted as Pennacook Abenaki territory. And on the westernmost side of the territory, at the end of those captive trails, is the nation of Missisquoi, and you'll note Coas is also on this map. There's a poignant reference above that to Arwasagundikuk, which translates to empty cabin village, so named for the mission at Sillery that was abandoned after a smallpox outbreak. And then there's also, in very small lettering, Scatticook, here spelled Shattucook, at Missisquoi, representing that refugee community that had moved north. Now, Missisquoi also, interestingly enough, welcomed some French settlers who wanted to build a sawmill in 1748. But when the French and Indian Wars ended in 1763, English settlers and soldiers flooded into the region. Land speculators started spreading the falsehood that Abenaki people were not residents but foreigners, as a means to depict the land as free for the taking. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip through some slides because we are running short for time. But suffice to say that the Missisquoi forcefully resisted both English and Mohawk incursions into their land. But there's no evidence that any French or English authorities made any genuine attempt to seek justice. Making matters worse, the colonial governor of New Hampshire, Benning Wentworth, was empowered by the English king to issue new towns and charters east of New York and north of Massachusetts Bay. And the grants then created the impression there was no need to transact any deeds. Note that on this map, north is angled to the lower left. And in fact, on that map, it was stated that the lands were to be given explicitly to English soldiers who had fought in the French Indian Wars and who now settled these lands by right of conquest. Although the 1783 Treaty of Paris established a new border between America and Canada at the 45th parallel, the precise location remained ambiguous. Now, I am unfortunately going to have to shift very quickly forward in time, in the interest of time. As historian Colin Calloway has pointed out, by the late 1700s, when conflicts ended and even after colonial settlers moved in, Abenaki families quietly moved back to their old lands. Many of them, by the early 1800s, had adapted to settled lifestyles, living in farmsteads rather than wigwams, wearing a mix of native and European dress, and otherwise ceasing to look like exotic to others. Although new political borders cut across Indokina, Abenaki families generally ignored them, continuing to travel freely as they wished. Local town historians, however, started actively promoting the myth that Abenaki people had abandoned the region and that any Indians spotted traveling were wanderers or interlopers. These basket makers travel to seasonal encampments at hotels along Lake Champlain and in the White Mountains, and at tourist destinations like Saratoga Springs and Lake George. Now, during this time, some Canadian Abenaki actually moved back to the U.S. in part provoked by this Canadian Indian Act, which explicitly banned dances and traditional ceremonies, forced children into industrial and residential schools, and these harsh measures explain why they chose to leave. The Abenaki families living in the U.S., by contrast, enjoyed considerable freedom of movement. Although often marginalized and impoverished, they continued their long-standing generational patterns of seasonal movement through familiar homelands. Margaret Tahamon, for example, recalled that her family traveled back and forth every fall and winter with a horse and wagon across the borders, paddling canoes up and down the lakes, and selling baskets and trading horses and doing what they called gypsying around. But there were dangers to being visible and being identified as gypsies. By 1911, Abenaki families in Vermont were targeted by advocates of eugenic sterilization. Henry Perkins at UVM was particularly concerned about the threat to Vermont's civil society and racial purity. He feared that the fine old stock of original settlers in Vermont were being overwhelmed. Can I do another 5? I can finish quickly. Were being overwhelmed by these native people who refused to disappear. Although the records concealed individual names and did not explicitly identify the sterilized as Abenaki, the damage was considerable. Apologies were issued by the University of Vermont in 2019 and by the Vermont State Legislature in 2021. Although most Abenaki families never appeared in the pages of regional town histories, some left informative reminiscences. For example, Sarah Jackson Summers lived most of her life in ancestral Coast territory in New Hampshire. The descendants still live there today, including historian Trudy Parker, her direct descendant. But the Parkers and the Tahamons and the Jacksons and so many Native people in census reports were identified as white. These Abenaki families were never truly hidden per se. They were well known to each other, but they were quite commonly misidentified by their non-Native neighbors as white, French, black, or even colored. Town census records, as a result, are incomplete and inaccurate, and federal census records are no better because they too were incomplete and were often not done at all. The lack of trustworthy records obscures the continuing presence, and Ojibwe historian Jean O'Brien calls this firsting and lasting. First, valorizes colonial settlers as though they are the first to live in a territory, and lasting eulogizes Native people as though they are dead and no longer count. Even well-known families were subject to misidentification. Israel Sedekis and Mary Watso in Keene, New Hampshire were well known as Abenakis, but their daughter's birth certificate identifies her as white. And I'll quickly go through this last section. Abenaki people have nonetheless retained important familial, cultural, and material connections to the ancestral past. As just one example, here's Elizabeth Sedekis' daughter, Lynn Murphy, measuring an ashland basket woven by her ancestor, Sophie Watso, documenting continuity over 8 generations. Each Abenaki family, each band, and each tribal nation has also maintained their own history and their own family stories, which are not always shared with the general public. Despite geographical and political differences that separate them, Abenaki people have continued crossing borders to join together in shared celebrations at Missisquoi, Odanak, and elsewhere. As one of many examples of that cross-border cooperation, Odanak citizen Cecile Wawanolet, who was, according to oral tradition, a descendant of Greylock, spent more than a decade teaching classes at Missisquoi, assisted by Mohegan Abenaki Jesse Bowman Bruchac. Her son, Joseph Gilly Joubert, continued this effort, serving as a mentor for the Abenaki language program at Middlebury College, which continues today. And so in closing, for generations before and after colonial contact, Abenaki families in Vermont have watched over burial grounds, sacred sites, hunting territories, and local ecologies while maintaining traditions. Since the early 1970s, they have also been collaborating with local colleges and museums to address the threat of looting and site destruction and facilitate the repatriation of human remains. And most recently, they have partnered with the Vermont Urban and Community Forest Program on the Black Ash Project to protect and monitor ash forests. These actions demonstrate the kind of persistence against all odds that characterizes so many Abenaki families in present-day Vermont today. We're going to thank you.
Again, I'm Catherine Sims, and I'm here to help moderate the panel discussion that we're about to have. As you've already heard today, today's forum is an opportunity for all of us, and especially the legislators in our presence, to deepen our understanding of Vermont's Abenaki communities, the Vermont Commission on Native American Affairs, and the state recognition process. And this panel was organized with one clear goal in mind: to educate, not to debate. We're here to listen and learn from Abenaki leaders, scholars, and allies, each of whom bring deep expertise and lived experience to our conversation today. Their perspectives offer critical insights into the historical, political, and cultural context of Indigenous Vermont. As you all know, in recent months, there has been a surge in public discourse around Abenaki identity and state recognition. While these conversations can be complex and sometimes contentious, this event is meant to ground us in history and respectful, informed dialogue. I'm pleased to introduce the distinguished panel of leaders and experts that we have with us today, including Giovanna Peoples, Dr. Peter Thomas, Chief Brenda Gagne, Chief Shirley Hook, Chief Roger Longtoe Sheehan, and Chief Don Stevens. And I'll direct you to your program for extended biographies of each of our panelists if you're interested in hearing more. We're really grateful for each of you to be here with your presence, your time, and your willingness to share your knowledge with us today. Before we get into the panel discussion, I just want to take a moment to set some clear expectations for the question and answer period, which will follow the panel. First and foremost, as you've already heard, this is a learning space, not a venue for debate or litigation. We welcome sincere, respectful questions, and we will not entertain personal attacks, inflammatory language, or attempts to undermine or interrogate individual identities. Second, we will first prioritize questions from legislators. This event is specifically designed to help inform the work of lawmakers, and we want to make sure their questions have space to be heard. And third, we ask that all audience members approach this conversation with humility and care. If you find yourself in disagreement, we ask that you stay open. This forum is about learning, not about winning an argument. And finally, if someone does cross a line, I will step in as moderator to redirect or close the conversation in order to protect the dignity of everyone involved in our conversation today. And we hope that this forum can model the kind of engagement that we want to see more of in Vermont: curious, compassionate, and rooted in an understanding to build, a desire to build understanding amongst us all. And so I'm going to start with Giovanna, and the question for you is based on your professional expertise and lived experience. What do you want legislators to know about the Vermont Abenaki?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. It was a really hard task I had. I was Vermont state archaeologist for 38 years, and summarizing everything I learned in that period of time, over the 30 years of that time that I worked with the Vermont Abenaki, has been really hard. I have about 10 minutes, and I know I'm going to go about a minute over that. I feel compelled to be here tonight to support Vermont's state-recognized Abenaki tribes because of my long memory and knowledge of these tribes and of these decades. I know and remember the complicated and difficult cultural and political contexts of the Vermont Abenaki's long journey to state recognition. And I think that memory is short and that so many people do not remember the cultural and the political context of these times. Since about 1986, I've spent hundreds of hours with members of the Vermont Abenaki communities. It has been a privilege of my life to do this, to work with them. We met in their homes, usually in the kitchen, walked through woods, fields, and around wetlands, talked in conference rooms, talked in this very building, and worked on solutions to some tough issues. And across these decades, we've done an enormous amount of educational work together in dozens of venues around the state. For all these years, I witnessed how people behaved, how they lived, what they thought, how they valued the land, and how they honored their ancestors. One especially relevant memory to today is a cold night in February in the early 90s. Odanak Chief Walter Watsow came to our home, right near here, for a ham supper. He came with Chief Homer St. Francis, UVM anthropologist Bill Haviland, and a number of other community members. We ate in my kitchen, and then we marched right down to this building for Farmers' Night to do a program on the Vermont Abenaki. How to compress a lifetime of knowledge and experience. So here's my first point. The Vermont Abenakis have been tenacious, tireless stewards of native burials in every part of the state. They pushed for these efforts and fought to protect the ancestors when others did not or could not. I can't begin to tell you the difficulty of this work and the amount of time involved. Now, both on the Vermont Alliance and the Abenaki Nation websites, they inventory many of these efforts. I really urge you to look at them. There's a lot of documentation in newspapers and publications. This gentleman's been documenting this stuff for 45 years, at least as old as I am. How old are you anyway these days? Beginning in 1986, for over 25 years, dear colleagues in my own historic preservation office, federal agencies, we worked elbow to elbow with Abenaki leadership and community members to protect unmarked burials. And with the state's help, which is actually a remarkable irony, considering the state's fear of recognizing the Vermont Abenakis, the Vermont Abenaki devoted extraordinary efforts with the state government. They worked with irate property owners, concerned and very confused select boards, with lawyers and regulators, with state government agencies, and with legislators. And I'm just going to skip along here because there's really not that much time. And again, the state of Vermont and the Vermont Abenakis, or together, we found the monies to buy and conserve properties. And then the Abenakis appropriately repatriated the ancestors. Together, the Vermont Abenaki and I worked in this building to amend Vermont laws to better protect unmarked burials. We developed protocols to deal with accidental discoveries. An important detailed record of the enormous work that the Vermont Abenakis have done is in the Vermont Commission on Native American Affairs archive. I really encourage you to look at the archive starting in 2006 if you want to see the effort of the Vermont Abenakis. Do remember that in 1991, Madeline Cunin also formed the commission, and so they had been hard at work for 15 years prior to 2006. So, second point, an important tool used by anthropologists is archaeology. In fact, many of us specialize in archaeology, although we're trained as anthropologists. Over 50 years, we've carefully pieced together an extraordinary and quite detailed story about Vermont's indigenous people in every corner of Vermont for the last 12,600 years. So what we have basically learned is the remarkable adaptability of the Vermont Abenakis through these 500 generations. Adapting meant survival, and Vermont's native inhabitants successfully survived through these 500 generations. This fluid way of life with ebbs and flows of movement and constant adaptation never changed. Marge spoke to that beautifully in terms of the fluidity of people's moves across the landscape, and it has continued well into the 20th century. And Vermont's Abenaki people lived this way well into recent memory. It was immediately apparent to me and other archaeologists here that Vermont Abenakis had a different sense and knowledge of the land than non-Abenakis, the non-native people. The land was imbued with family knowledge and old traditions. There was absolutely no doubt for me and for Vermont's other archaeologists that they had an intimacy with certain places in Swanton and Highgate, with the Burlington Intervale, with parts of the Connecticut River, and various other areas of Vermont. These Abenaki heartlands have archaeological evidence of thousands of years of occupation and continual use. Third point, I only have 3 points and a conclusion. We're almost there. Archaeology is the study of past people when we don't have written records. As archaeologists, we know that most of history was never written down. For most of history, people didn't write. Across northeastern North America and everywhere else, indigenous people did not read and write until the early 20th century, at the earliest. My historical research in the late 70s into Vermont agricultural history was my first experience in the absence of historic records. I learned that memory is terribly short. In literate societies, there's some misconception that we write everything down, that we know everything. Well, guess what? We do not now, and we did not then. The people who were doing the writing were subjective about what they chose to write, subjective in how they interpreted what they observed, and what they wrote to meet their own needs. They wrote native and marginalized people in and out of stories, mainly out of stories. They changed someone's name simply because they couldn't spell an Indian word. And they wrote entire communities out of the history books. And unless you live in Swanton, Burlington, and Brattleboro, virtually every Vermont town history starts in with the earliest settlers. No one else existed. European conventions of government, of law, of land, of justice, and of naming overwhelmed our history long before 1791. These European conventions were powerful forces in eradicating much of Native history in the United States, in northern New England, and in Vermont. So I stopped into the bookstore yesterday, picked up Ned Blackhawk. He's a Shoshone Indian, and he completely reaffirms that historic documents have written Native Americans out of history. It's a grave mistake to rely on reports like the 2002 Attorney General's response to the St. Francis Okokie Band's petition for federal recognition and on similar documents. They judged the indigeneity of Vermont's Native people through subjective, European-centered interpretation of incomplete and biased historic records. You writing this down, Sean? And on the absence of documents. That 2002 report was used and abused by the United States Bureau of Indian Affairs, and it continues to be used and abused to this day. I encourage you to take a look at Judge Joseph Walchick's 1989 decision and findings of fact in State v. St. Francis if you want to see a whole different perspective on Vermont Abenaki's history. And the resource list that was passed out has that. It's on the various websites. So now to conclude. There's a severely mistaken idea that there's European-based evidentiary standards that the Vermont Abenaki need to meet. I and many scholars respectfully disagree if this evidentiary standard is based on documentation. Too many historians rely wholly on biased and incomplete documents to interpret what happened in the past. As anthropologists and ethnographers, we use a broader range of tools than just documents. As anthropologists, we know the importance of oral traditions. That is, cultural values, stories, and traditions that are passed along by the spoken word and not written down. We know from studying cultures around the world that unwritten language, unwritten knowledge, is passed down from person to person, family to family, is central to a people's history and identity. The Vermont Abenakis base their identity on many things, including documents, if and when they're available, genealogies, if and when they're available, and on their traditions, stories, and values passed down in spoken form from one or more ancestors. Their long ancestral connections to the land in various parts of Vermont is beyond doubt. The indigeneity of all 4 state-recognized Abenaki tribes is solidly based on powerful family histories, stories, and traditions passed along through families. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we're going to turn to Dr. Peter Thomas to add to the conversation what else you think legislators should know about the Vermont Abenaki.
I suppose it would help if I put my reading glasses on. I'm going to take the opportunity to keep sitting. I got a bum knee at the age of 80. I claim the right to do that, but here goes. I want to do three things. I'm going to touch on three things. I want to talk about my personal experience working with members of the Abenaki community. I want to put the Abenaki and their petition for recognition into a context of Native communities in the 1970s and 60s. And I want to provide some observations. I was one of the reviewers of the Missisquoi Abenaki petition for state recognition. So if you're interested in my entire testimony, somewhere on that list, I think it's the fourth one down, you can read the entire, my entire response to the legislature and to the commission. Well, I arrived at UVM in 1978 and ran the consulting program there for over 20 years. Well, almost immediately I received a contract from the National Park Service to do an archaeological survey of the Missisquoi Wildlife Refuge, which they were planning to conduct or construct 5 miles of dikes. Well, the Abenaki tribe organization was up and running in Swanton by that time. They had an office in the old railroad station. So I dropped in to talk with Chief Leonard Lampman and several of the others to discuss the project. I listened to their concerns about the refuge and the importance of the refuge played in their lives. And I was granted, very grateful for the assistance that Chief Lampman offered, which was to ferry my field crew across the Missisquoi River in the morning and pick them up at night in his canoe because there wasn't any way to get to the refuge by land. So the result of that survey, which is kind of mind-boggling, was that we excavated test pits at 60-foot intervals for 1.5 miles. And over 50% of those test pits had prehistoric native pottery or stone tools associated with it. We had managed to hit one of the focal areas of Native American settlement that has gone on there for centuries. Well, that project began a quarter century of dialogue with the Missisquoi community. I worked with a number of the community members to address the burial of human remains that Giovanna has touched on, that were dug up particularly in the 1970s and more recently. Young members of that community worked an entire summer alongside my field team in Highgate, where we were excavating a complex of pre-contact native sites spanning thousands of years. And everyone I met was open, enthusiastic, respectful, and engaged. Based on what I observed, these folks may have had a different perspective on life, given the prejudice they'd faced growing up, but they were certainly not recent wannabes, who, from my experience, are typically self-obsessed, self-serving, and egotistical. The efforts of these Vermont families who have lived in northwestern Vermont for at least 1.5 centuries, if not longer, were directed towards the welfare of family, extended family, and community. Well, in 2000, I took an early retirement buyout from UVM, and I began a career with FEMA doing disaster recovery operations throughout New England and as far south as the Gulf Coast and as far west as Alaska. And part of my experience was working with tribes across the country to address their damages and needs from disasters. Well, the emergence and revitalization and other Missisquoi and other Abenaki events in Vermont that I'd observed was not unique. This upwelling of tribal activity was, at least in part, sparked by the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the 70s. Desegregation, the American Indian movement, and other resurgent movements in which marginalized and disadvantaged communities throughout the country stood up and demanded recognition, respect, and civil justice. All of the tribes in southern New England, the Wampanoag, the Narragansett, the Mohegan, Pequot, Mashpee, Nipmuc, Stockbridge, responded in one way or another to address their specific needs at this time. Some received federal recognition, others did not. But guess what? They all are still here. Some received, needless to say, pushback from the power brokers and the political elites at the federal, state, and town level was rather pronounced. I watched this play out in Vermont, as did many of you probably. Although looking at some of the faces, you may not have even been born at that point. In 2012, I was asked by the Vermont Commission on Native American Affairs and various legislative committees if I would review the documentation which the Abenaki Nation at Missisquoi St. Francis Sakoki Band had submitted with its request for state recognition. I agreed upon clearing my participation with FEMA's Office of General Counsel to ensure that my involvement would not prove to be an ethics violation. And contrary to recent false accusations in the press, I did so without any compensation from any party. Criteria 6 of the legislature's 9 conditions for state recognition asked how the tribe would address the social, economic, political, or cultural needs of its members with ongoing educational programs and activities. The listed accomplishments was rather mind-boggling and demonstrated the enormous commitment of time and personal initiative on the part of the Abenaki Tribal Council, the Abenaki Self-Help Association, and the Abenaki community at large to improve the conditions of its members. When such efforts began in 1976 for tribal organization, the obstacles to community betterment were enormous. Nearly 40% of the Missisquoi families had no income from employment. 66 of the heads of households had neither a high school diploma nor a GED. Health and housing conditions were alarming. These challenges were met through creative efforts to develop an affordable housing project, to expand basic literacy, and to prevent school dropouts. If you look back 35 years, the Abenaki dropout rate at Missisquoi Union High School was 70%, with 50% leaving school before the 9th grade. In 2012, the dropout rate was 3%, and conversational Abenaki was being taught in the local high school. In 1982, fewer than 5% of the Abenaki who graduated received any post-secondary school education. By 2009, 40% of the Abenaki high school graduates went out of college. In 1980, the Federal Commission of Administration for Native Affairs, this is the federal, identified the Abenaki Self-Help Association as one of the 12 outstanding Native social service agencies in the country. This is not a group, though this is not a record that any group of pretend Indians could have ever achieved. A parallel revival was also seems to have occurred at Odanak. Gordon Day, have I got to wrap this up?
She's gesturing.
All right, well, I'll go on to the last page. So basically, I'm really deeply saddened by all this vitriolic clamor that's been going on in the press. There was a time when Odanak and Missisquoi supported one another. Missisquoi was also, in its petition, was also buoyed by its relationships with other tribes throughout New England. Just as one example of more recent helping one another, when the young folks at Odanak were not interested in learning how to speak Abenaki, one of the elders agreed to be driven to Swanton each Saturday to teach young Abenakis here. And when Missisquoi petitioned for state recognition in 2012, the councils of the federally recognized tribes of Narragansett, Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Wampanoag, Mohegan, and Haudenosaunee all sent letters of support. The refrain that I've heard from tribes across the country, "We know who we are," should not be ignored. I thought that we as Vermonters had gotten past the days when our 4th grade Vermont history books informed us that Indians never lived in Vermont. Do we really want to be troubled again with such a stamp of ignorance? So I, for one, vote no.
Thank you, Peter. And now we'll turn to the chiefs. And I'll just remind us that we're kind of running up against a slightly unexpected time crunch. And so if we're able to kind of keep our presentations kind of under 10 minutes total, that'll save some space and time for questions and discussion after. So first we'll turn to Chief Brenda Gagne of the Missisquoi Abenaki Nation.
Quay. Missisquoi is the largest tribe in the state of Vermont. We're all proud, every one of us that sit at this table. We know who we are, we know what we've been through, and what's most important is that we all stay together no matter what else goes on. As for the state of Vermont, they've stepped with us and have done, and I pray that they keep doing that because we are truly who we are. And us having to keep telling people who we are is kind of obnoxious to me. It gets old. I thought in a lifetime my grandchildren wouldn't have this, where my granddaughter was attacked verbally at a UVM symposium by a so-called indigenous man. And anybody who's indigenous knows children are the highest level of respect in the elders and women. And that would have never happened if they truly were indigenous. And us being called out on things bothers me. Coming here today, we fed 33 families today in our food pantry. That's what I should be doing. We should be taking care of the people, feeding the people, and not having to keep coming and explain who we are and what's gone on and what's next. As for Missisquoi, we are doing as much culture as we can, teaching as much as we can. We are trying to work on the river of Missisquoi. We're doing on the butternut trees, which have a fungus, if you don't know that, which is major to our people, to the ash tree. There's so many things that we are doing as stewards of the land that we've always done, and we will keep doing that because if we don't, we're not going to have this. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. And now we can turn to Chief Shirley Hook of the Coasac Traditional Band of the Coasac.
Thank you very much.
Put it a little closer because you're quiet.
Oh, I don't like being real loud.
I know.
Well, one thing I'd like to say to you that we are farmers. We're growers. How do I know that? The kitchen floor is completely covered with over 1,000 seedlings right now that should be repotted, and I'm not there. And they had a long jilt across the country, and so that's what we do is farm and take care of our kids, grandchildren, and family, and we would like to continue doing that. I don't mind being a farmer. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming today.
And now we'll turn to Chief Don Stevens of the Mohegan Band of the Coasac Abenaki Nation.
Quite greetings, everybody. We are also one of the larger tribes in the state of Vermont. I just want to depart and leave you all with all we have ever tried to do is survive. From our ancestors who were caught up in the eugenics programs, like my grandmother who was born as Lillian, married as Pauline, and died as Delia because she was listed in the survey. Just trying to survive. The bad thing is the eugenics happened. The good thing is it documented us as Indian. We are well documented as Indian, living here, traveling in wagons, and as you saw with one of Marge's things, you know, when you're trying to move 75 people and 35 teams of horses, going from your summer to your winter ground, selling baskets, that's a tribe. And they mentioned that in the eugenics. Even Perkins said it was a tribe. From 1700s all the way down to me, we have a continuity of connection as being indigenous people living in the state of Vermont, moving amongst our traditional homelands. So anybody that says that we just popped up, we don't have any connection, just go to the website and see it's all public record. The eugenics documented it, which was unfortunate. And that's why we fought so hard to get the apology, so we could finally get past all of this noise and actually start moving forward. And we are. We're preserving our language. 2 years of doing language, English Abenaki, so people can learn the language, which will outlive us. We're feeding just around 700 people from Holland, Vermont, which you can't get any closer to the Canadian border, from Holland, Vermont, all the way down to New Hampshire. We're feeding people. We're doing cultural programs. We're not in this for money. Do you think we want to wake up every morning and be called self-identified or like some sort of fake or fraud or indigenous or non-indigenous? Do you think we like our integrity challenged? We don't do this because of any other reason than wanting to honor those people who were caught up in the eugenics and our ancestors who just wanted to survive, to us being able to fight for their integrity and then leave something for our children so they don't have to fight this fight. It's been 14 years as of yesterday that El Nu and Mohegan were recognized, and we're still talking about this today. That is just ridiculous and crazy. We know who we are. We will never stop being who we are, regardless of what people do. We are proud Abenaki Indian, and we will always be that way, and we will always help our community. So that's what I want to say, is that if you want to learn about our lived experience, we take nothing away from Abenaki. They have their lived experience, we have ours. Whether they work with us or not, that's their choice. But we're actually working to better people and uplift people. We're not tearing anybody down. If you want to learn about the lived experience of the Vermont Abenaki, just contact us. We're not forcing any of our culture on any of you. When people come and ask, we try to teach. Until then, we work within our community to protect and try to uplift. And I've been around this state house many times, so I know a lot of you. Never be afraid to come and ask us a question. So I just want to say thank you for being here, and let's get past all this nonsense.
Thank you, and now we'll turn to Chief Roger Longtoshian of El Nu Abenaki.
So we're the smallest tribe in Vermont. We're about 75 members. There are places like in southern Vermont, as one archaeologist said, we're like the redheaded stepchild of archaeology on the eastern side of the state in the south, right? But we've been there forever. You know, our families have moved in, moved back, families, you know, many. There are places that are sacred places like Bellows Falls. The land that we acquired, that Rich actually raised most of the money to buy, where our tribal headquarters is. There are also 2 places that have petroglyphs. Okay, those petroglyphs are there for a reason, because our ancestors put them there. And behind each of those petroglyph areas, there are burials. Most of those burials are gone now. People have dug them up in Bellows Falls. Every time they grade the ground, they would hit a head, because people were in a kind of a sitting position. And the same thing down in Brattleboro. We have the same thing going on. These places are on the western side of the river. That's the way to the Milky Way. That's where the spirits go, to the spirit world. All right? We know this stuff because we live here. We live there. You know, it's part of our history and culture and stuff. You know, it's the Abenaki people. One of the things that has saved us over the years, especially down here in the States, is that we broke up and we'd head into the hills. We'd go into small family groups, okay? Some folks moved over the border into Quebec. That land up there was not originally ours. That was Algonquin country, okay? And they had to actually, the Canadian government, actually the Jesuits, had to get that land from the Algonquin people and cede it over to the Abenaki people that are up there now. So people left. They moved, you know, there was no borders. Today there are. You've got people that are down here, they're Vermont Abenakis. You got folks on the other side of the border, they're Canadian Abenakis. And our families don't always match because we didn't move up there. Or if we did, we might have passed through there for, you know, on a trip and come back and forth, which we know has been going on. Till about 30 years ago, there was plenty of relationships between Odanak, Wolanak, and the people down here in Vermont. And there still is, yeah. I mean, well, Don's got some people that have been actually up there the last couple of years singing up there at their powwows. All right, they get invited to go up there. But, you know, money and politics clouds people's minds. And they start to dislike people, you know, when there's something like that going on. And that's kind of where we're at here. So we've always been here. And we'll always stay here. You know, and we're close to where the ones are buried.
Thank you all for sharing your expertise and your experience. And so now we're going to turn it, and with the few remaining minutes that we have, open it up to questions, and maybe we can start with any legislators in the room. And I'll just say, obviously, in 7 minutes, we can't probably get to all of the questions that are in the room, but hopefully this is just one of many conversations that can continue as we seek to build common understanding around this topic. And we have a mic runner. So if anyone has a question for our panel, or maybe we'll just turn the handheld mic off and we'll just ask folks to stand up and ask the question.
I'm Michael Morgan. I'm a state rep from Grand Isle County, and west portion of Milton is my district. I was at the last presentation, if you want to call it that. Maybe I'd call it a hijacking back 2 months ago of the Odanak when they were here talking about whatever they were here to talk about. But it was, I think it's talking with Chief Don a bit ago, there's, I don't know what all their motivations are, but they need to leave people here alone. I'm sorry, brother.
The media also would be great if they would have two-sided.
And Mike, if I can encourage us to get to a question.
Yeah, no, it wasn't, but mine's just a statement, Catherine, that's all that I've talked with many, many legislators in my travels since that meeting. Maybe there's a pocket of some people that have issue or want to do something to change the indigenous people's status here. But I don't believe there's any groundswell movement from what I've seen. And I've told all my friends that are here that have asked me that question that I don't think that there's any groundswell movement to do anything to take away that, and because I know that's a fear for some people. If there is, I'm not aware of it.
Right, Morgan, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, heard. And we're going to go to Rep. Chena in the back. Question for the panel.
Yeah, it's a question. We created, it's a question, but I have to make a sentence first. We created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to address colonization and eugenics, and I hope to...
State House is closing in 15 minutes. Please have your belongings and exit the building. Thank you for visiting.
They couldn't interrupt, so they
State
pressed
House
the button.
in 15 minutes. Please have your belongings walk-ins and exit the building. Thank you for visiting.
Okay, so we created Truth and Reconciliation, and despite people's efforts to short-circuit that, I look forward to the process of seeing what comes out of it. In the meantime, what do you need from us? While we're waiting for that to happen, what do you need? Because this attack clearly is having an impact. Some of you are my friends and we've talked. What can we do to help right now?
Well, I'll answer that from my point of view. I think that we have always been Vermonters. We have always looked at you as being your constituents, and we ask that you take and work with us in partnership like we've done for so many years. And why are we entertaining a foreign entity in a foreign country over your own constituents? And it causes a lot of fear. They want to know why we actually went into hiding for so many years. And you wonder why, after you see the media and you see the attacks on us, why people want to stand up and say, hey, I'm over here.
Yeah.
And our children. I think what we need is to be really clear by the legislators that, look, this issue is done. Let's move forward in partnership, and let's find ways to operate.
Other questions? First legislator.
I'd like to respond to the gentleman's question, because I was the vice chair of the Commission on Native American Affairs, and we had the council meeting with the commission members and the chiefs, and we came to very clear conclusions in that council meeting that we did in a traditional way. And we had 4 needs that all the tribes agreed to. And the first was that we need a meaningful land basis for each tribe. We have no land to take our children to teach them about the plants, the standing ones that feed us and heal us. We have no land to teach them the old ways and the customs. So we need a meaningful land base for each tribe. We need a health center that is culturally sensitive for each tribe. That was Chief Rogers' suggestion. Everybody agreed to this. We need the State Board of Education to mandate that the truth be taught about our people and our history. Because I sat as a child in school and was being told, no Indians ever lived here. They just traveled through. But that was the basis for the land taking over. And the 4th thing was that we have many people in Vermont who aren't Abenaki, but are indigenous people. From Huron to Lakota to quite a lot of Blackfeet, a lot of different tribes. And there needs to be some kind of center where we can have intertribal gatherings so that they too can celebrate indigenous kinds of cultural events. Just those 4 things, that's what we need.
Brannigan, a question for Pam?
Well, I know we're running out of time, but I remember writing up that statute with Vince Lizzie years ago. We included 3 things. One was to set up the process for recognizing the tribes, and that seems to be going well. The second one was to allow Native craftsmen to sign their work as Indian made, and that would allow them to get a lot more money for their crafts. That was really important from an economic development standpoint. And the third thing was that children from the tribal families would be able to have proof that they were indigenous people, and it would allow them to go to school with scholarships based on their native heritage. That was very important. Vince and I talked about that for a long time. And I didn't hear your executive director. I might have missed it, but is that the young people being able to use that native heritage to get scholarships?
We can.
Is that
Absolutely. We have a scholarship guide.
all right? I didn't hear it when she went.
She probably did, but we do. We have that.
Okay, terrific. That's all I want.
Thank you for that context about your experience as a legislator. And unfortunately, we are now at our 10 minutes to transition to keep Agatha happy in our use of the building.